The United Nations released its third ever climate change report today. In it, a grim assessment of where the environment is headed.
The jury has reached a verdict, and it is damning. This report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a litany of broken climate promises. It is a file of shame, cataloguing the empty pledges that put us firmly on track towards an unlivable world. We are on a fast track to climate disaster. Major cities underwater, unprecedented heat waves, terrifying storms, widespread water shortages, the extinction of 1 million species of plants and animals. And this is not fiction or exaggeration. It is what science tells us will result from our current energy policies.
The CBC's Karina Roman is in Ottawa and is following that story. Karina, a big report. Can you give us its main findings?
Well, it's the third installment of this report, in that the previous report, which was out earlier this winter, talked about the climate science and its impact. Today's installment is really about solutions to the problems. And it's focused on solutions that would get us to and keep us at a 1.5 degree warming and no higher. So, of course, solutions are not really unexpected, except of how stark they have to be. So when they talk about emissions reductions, they are talking about deep emissions cuts. No more fossil fuel investments, stopping fossil fuel subsidies, basically leaving what's left of fossil fuels in the ground in terms of stuff that has not been planned yet to take out. Could be more than $1 trillion worth of fossil fuels in the ground, leave them there. Huge investments in renewables and renewable energy, electrification of economies, and ways to address the unsustainable land use that the world engages in, as well as consumption. Most of our consumption is also a problem. And why is this urgent? Well, because the science, as you heard here, is grim. The UN Secretary General there did not mince words. And basically, he says right now, despite all the pledges, the world is well off track. Here's what he had to say.
Climate activists are sometimes depicted as dangerous radicals. But the truly dangerous radicals are the countries that are increasing the production of fossil fuels. Investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure is moral and economic madness.
So when we talk about investments in renewables, the report also talks about how, there's a lot of cost that goes into trying to keep our warming down, but it's not taken into account the mitigation. I mean, the cost of not doing it is huge as well. And we thought, you just look at the fires and floods we have here in Canada, especially most recently in British Columbia. The cost of adaptation is huge. And so it doesn't take into account, when you're looking at the price tag to try and invest in renewables, for example, you need to take into account what you'll save if you don't have a burning and flooding planet.
And Karina, what does this mean for Canada?
Well, it does taste in the report, of course, wealthy countries are the worst emitters, and Canada per capita is one of the worst out of the wealthy countries. It says Canada per capita emissions are 2.6 times higher than the G20 average. We're the only G7 country whose emissions have increased since the 2015 Paris Accord. We have a very clean electricity grid, but electricity makes a very small portion of what we rely on. Most of it is still fossil fuels, especially oil and gas. And even if you remember last week's emission reduction plan, there really actually is no call for a reduction in production. It's really all about, right now, targets for emissions, but not actually reducing production. And that's a problem for Canada, as well as, while there's good things like the thumbs up we're given for carbon pricing and how that price will increase and how we want to move towards zero emission vehicles. Even with our plans, even with our targets, Canada is really on track for, if we were to help the world reduce to 1.5%, our efforts will really only get us to a 4 degree warming, not a 1.5 degree warming. And as you heard from the Secretary General of the UN, that kind of increase would be catastrophic for the world.
CBC's Karina Roman in Ottawa. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So let's stay on this story. We've reached Catherine McKenna, the former Minister of Environment and Climate Change here in Canada, and was just appointed as the chair of a new UN panel on climate change progress at the corporate and local levels. First off, congratulations on your new appointment, Ms. McKenna.
Thank you very much. It actually seems even more important today.
Yeah, absolutely. I wish you could see my notes in front of me that I have the million questions to ask you. But first off, let's get to this report. It says there is that brief, there is that rapidly closing window for us to limit warming of our atmosphere. Do you think this can be done? It sounds very dire when you listen to the UN Secretary General.
Look, it can be done, but let's be clear what the report is saying. It says we're not on track for a 1.5 degree world. We're not on track for a 2 degree world. It did show that emissions, are not rising as quickly as before, although they're at a historic rate. So the reality is we can do this. And this is what keeps me up at night, is how do we get the world to just do what we need to do? And the report is very clear. We need to deal with fossil fuels. That is the major contributor to climate change, and we have solutions. So it's really now about doing the work.
Let me just jump in there. So fossil fuels are, in your words there, the biggest contributor. But even here in Canada, when the emissions reduction plan came out last week, there was no cap set as of yet for the fossil fuel industry. And yes, they do say they're going to be net zero by 2050, but that's still pie in the sky, really.
Well, actually, let's be clear what the plan did say. I mean, what are you trying to do with a climate plan? You're trying to reduce emissions, of course, also adapt to climate change. So it said that for the first time ever, it had approached by sectors and tackled sectors, including oil and gas. And it said to oil and gas, you need to reduce your emissions by over 40% by 2030. So that is what they need to do.
But hold on a sec. It actually isn't. If you compare the apples to oranges, by 2005 levels, it's actually only around 30%, 32%.
But the reason they picked 2019 as current levels because emissions have actually gone up from the sector. I think the broad point is, for the first time ever, the federal government is saying to sectors, including oil and gas, you have to reduce emissions. And for a long time, the oil and gas sector has talked about emissions intensity going down. The planet doesn't care about emissions intensity going down. It cares about overall emissions. And so the oil and gas sector emissions have been going up. And it means you could plant every tree you want in Canada, retrofit every building, everyone drives an electric vehicle, and it won't matter. So this is critically important, and it is not to be underestimated how important that is to actually meeting the target, which is a more ambitious target, reducing emissions by 40%. But I think the devil will be in the detail. Will we actually see the sector do this? And what's also important in the report. So the report is a report on solutions. It's a third report from scientists. The first report was about the causes of climate change, which we know what they are, and the situation we're in, which is very dire. The second was the consequences and how do we adapt to climate change. And this is really the solutions. So what is important is that while we know we absolutely need to reduce emissions from fossil fuels, there are no magic bullets, because often people like to talk about carbon removal. And while there's a recognition that that can be a small part of the solution, so that's things like nature-based solutions, but what is called carbon capture and storage that the oil and gas sector, is really looking at, and that's part of a solution, but it is a very tiny part. The folks have to do the real work themselves, which actually links to what the Secretary General asked me to do, which is have this expert panel that's going to make sure that companies, including oil and gas companies, but across the board, folks have said they're going to be net zero by 2050. And it's interesting because I told my kids this, and they're like, 2050? That is way too late.
Yeah, that comes back to my question, though. Here in Canada, yes, they've had these, aspirational, we say it must be this, you say 40, I say 32, whatever, in different levels. But there is no, what happens if they don't meet these? What is the actual goal? So if that isn't set, then it's problematic.
Well, this is apparently going to be the goal, the target, but I think we need to see that. We need to see a cap of emissions at 40%, which is higher than 30%, so that's good. But we also need to see that the work is, that is actually being done. It's not just technological solutions that aren't there yet at scale and can be problematic. And so, I mean, I think everyone's waiting to see. But the climate plan, it includes a whole range of other things that are important. So we have very strong methane regulations that will be reducing emissions by 75%, a clean fuel standard, which actually is one of the, if not the largest reduction in emissions, very significant, although once again, waiting to see the details. And then there's carbon pricing. And so Canada has actually done a humongous amount in terms of having a credible plan. And it's brought in more details to this plan, now targeting sectors. And we do need to see the whole world doing this. And I think this report is just clear how big the challenge is. And we have a choice. Like, I think all countries around the world have a choice, but especially developed countries that really have been the major contributors historically. Do we want to stay at below 1.5 degrees? So do we want to ensure a sustainable planet, or are we just going to have to rely on trying to adapt, which will be impossible as warming increases?
So just a final question. Like I said, I could pick your brain forever on this topic for sure. So your new role in the coming months, you're set to make recommendations, achievable net zero recommendations, those targets. Can you give our audience maybe some concrete example, and when exactly might we see this report? No pressure.
Well, the Secretary General, I met with him last week, and he said by COP27, which is not a long time, and it's an international panel, so there are 15 other members, so I can't preempt them. But I mean, I think what's really clear is it's great that everyone's saying they want to be net zero by 2050, but what does that mean? And, we also need to see ambitious action right now by 2030, certainly, because we have a huge way to go to meet 1.5 degrees. And there's no way we'll make it if we wait till 2049. But also, I think there needs to be accountability. We need to see transparency. We need to see what real action folks are doing. They can't just go and buy credits or rely on carbon capture and storage. And so it's really holding businesses to account, investors to account, and also cities to account. And it will deal with greenwashing. I mean, the whole point is we don't want folks just saying, I got a target of being net zero by 2050. That's the easy part. The hard part is actually doing the work, including by 2030.